A teacup cracked from within, whispered a truth no one dared speak. Not in that house, not in that silence. Something was wrong long before the fall, before the rope gave way, before the lie took root. In a place where appearances reigned and porcelain was prized, a single fracture revealed the darkness beneath. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a fog-heavy morning in the early weeks of February in the year 1891 that I found myself once more at Baker Street, confined indoors by the unrelenting chill and low-hanging grey that pressed itself against the window panes. Holmes, as ever, was already awake and pacing silently by the fire, his lean frame bent over a cluttered table of chemical instruments that hissed and smoked in quiet protest. He had spoken but once since dawn, and that only to inquire whether I had consumed the last of the marmalade. It was then that my eyes landed on a brief column buried in the inner folds of the Times. The sudden death of a retired judge by accidental fall in his own study. Tragic, no doubt, I muttered aloud, folding the paper. Holmes did not so much as glance up. He was bent over a retort, a long glass tube tilted precisely to allow two pale liquids to coalesce at its tip. "I should think, Watson," he murmured, "that one more judge succumbing to gravity is no more peculiar than a constable succumbing to drink." And yet, as if summoned by irony itself, a firm knock sounded at the door, deliberate, genteel, and unmistakably urgent. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, bearing a card and a curious expression. "A lady, sir. Says she won't give her name, but insists it's a matter for Mr. Holmes alone." When the visitor entered, I was struck at once by her composure. She wore a dark travelling cloak, a simple hat with a netted veil, and gloves of soft velvet that she did not remove, even once seated, though her posture was perfectly upright. There was a tremor in her breath that suggested a mind not so entirely composed as her manner implied. Without preamble, the woman reached into her handbag and withdrew a small black lacquered box, which she set on the table between us. "I do not know if I am mad," she said quietly, "but this does not make sense." She opened the lid to reveal a single porcelain teacup, its glaze a pale celadon green, its edges gilded with age. It was fractured cleanly along its base, not shattered, but cracked in a precise jagged line, as if from within. Holmes leaned forward, saying nothing at first, his eyes moving rapidly over the object. "No trace of adhesive," he muttered. "No warping of the glaze." The woman folded her gloved hands. "It was found beside my father's body." Holmes did not look up. "And yet, he never drank from such a cup. I can tell already." Holmes turned the cup gently in his fingers, then placed it back into its cushioned recess. His voice, when it came, was low and devoid of sympathy. "Madam, this is not the only thing being concealed. You have come here with a fracture, yes, but not merely in porcelain. There is something else you have not told us. Something missing from the story, just as there is something missing from this object. You brought us a riddle, and riddles I find are far more instructive than explanations." She said nothing, but I saw her jaw clench behind the veil. It would be another 10 minutes before we learned her name. And yet I felt, even then, that the case had already begun. Not with the death of a man, nor the appearance of a woman in mourning, but with the fractured teacup resting silently in its case, like a whispered confession too fragile to be spoken aloud. "My name," the woman said at last, "is Miss Lavinia Willoughby. My father was Judge Horace Willoughby, recently, and I'm told, accidentally deceased." Her voice did not tremble, but it was held tightly, as though each word were a carefully drawn breath. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his fingers steepled before him, eyes fixed not on her face, but on her gloved hands, which she kept folded in her lap like a fragile keepsake. I recalled the name instantly, the same Judge Willoughby whose passing I had remarked in the paper earlier that morning. The man had been widely known in legal circles, and perhaps equally disliked outside of them. "I do not come to you as a grieving daughter," she continued. "I come as one who suspects that what has been called an accident may be something far more deliberate. My father," she said, "was found at the foot of his study bookshelf 3 days ago. The coroner ruled it a fall. He struck his temple on the corner of the mahogany desk." She paused. "No inquest was held. His age and history of fainting spells sufficed as explanation." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet?" Miss Willoughby reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded cloth. Within it, I saw again the fractured teacup we had examined earlier, jagged through the base, yet curiously intact around the rim. "This," she said, "was found on the floor beside him. My father never drank tea in that room. Not once in all the years I lived at Graange." Holmes's eyes brightened with sudden clarity. "And so the cup does not match the room. Intriguing. A detail out of place. And as you rightly suspect, Miss Willoughby, murder often announces itself with such misplacements." "It is not merely out of place," she said. "It is impossible." I leaned forward. "In what way?" "The cup is from a set. Chinese export porcelain. Gifted to my mother on her wedding day. She died 5 years ago, and the set has remained locked in a glass cabinet in the drawing room ever since. No one uses them. No one touches them." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Yet this one found its way to the floor beside a corpse." "Yes." "Who possesses the key to the cabinet?" "Myself. And it has not left my person since." Holmes turned the cup gently once more in his palm. "Then we are left with 3 mysteries: a broken vessel, an unused room, and an untouched cabinet." Holmes remained motionless for a moment, then looked up, not at the cup, but at Miss Willoughby. "You have cleaned and reloaded a revolver within the last 48 hours. The remark struck even me with surprise. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "That is surely—" "Observe the inner seam of her right glove," Holmes said calmly. "There, beneath the 3rd finger, you'll find a faint brownish stain, cordite residue, dulled slightly by a layer of lemon oil. It is the sort of cleaning solution often kept in country houses." She did not deny it. "You have not slept well. The creases in the glove suggest it was worn over unmoisturized skin, repeatedly clenched. And the pressure marks on your handbag strap indicate you carry more weight than one might expect from silken paper. I would wager a pistol is tucked within it now." Miss Willoughby's face remained composed. "I have reason to be afraid, Mr. Holmes. That is why I am here." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers once more. "Tell me of your household, Miss Willoughby." "There is my father's butler, Mr. Greaves. He has been with us for nearly 20 years. The maid Celia came into service 2 years ago, and my cousin, Felix." "Older or younger?" "Younger by 7 years. He recently returned from Bombay. My father offered him residence while he considered prospects." Holmes's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. "Ah, a returned colonial cousin, idle and recently admitted into the household." She nodded. "Felix is charming, but not particularly industrious. He plays cards, loudly." "And your father's disposition toward him?" Miss Willoughby hesitated. "Tolerant, at times cold, but never cruel." Holmes did not speak for several seconds. Then, softly, "The greatest cruelty often lies not in action, but in inheritance." Holmes stirred slightly. "And what, may I ask, did your father intend to leave behind?" The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Then, without blinking, Miss Willoughby said, "A great deal. To the wrong people." "Be more precise." "My father changed his will 6 weeks ago. The details were not made public, but I was told, not by him, that Felix was to be made principal heir. The servants were also to receive large bequests. I was to receive the teacup set, Watson interjected, a curious gesture. Perhaps symbolic, she said. My mother's things meant more to me than his estate. Holmes's voice was quiet now. So who had reason to hasten Judge Willoughby's end? She looked up, finally meeting his gaze. Everyone in that house, Doctor. Everyone. As our visitor sat in silence, her fingers tracing the handle of the fractured cup, I felt compelled to speak. Holmes, I said gently, this may be no more than coincidence. A fall, a forgotten object, a tragic end for an old man. Holmes raised a single finger. There is no such thing as coincidence in death, Watson. Only patterns we have not yet discerned. But to build a theory on a teacup. But this is no ordinary cup. It does not belong in that room, nor in that moment. It announces its misplacement like a trumpet in a funeral procession. Miss Willoughby glanced at Holmes with faint astonishment. So you believe me? I believe the evidence, madam. And the evidence says your father did not die by accident. The fracture is not in porcelain alone. It is in the narrative. And I intend to follow that crack to its source. Miss Willoughby rose, collecting the teacup in its cloth as delicately as if it were an injured bird. Holmes stood, offering a rare courteous bow. We shall call at Hollow Graange before the day ends, he said. And if there is truth to be unearthed, I shall find it. She hesitated at the door, then said softly, Thank you, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. And she vanished into the corridor like a whisper receding into fog. I turned to Holmes. So, the game is afoot then? Holmes smiled faintly, his gaze still fixed on the now empty chair. No, Watson. The game is no longer afoot. It's already begun. It was nearing dusk when we arrived at Hollow Graange, the air thick with mist and the gravel drive damp underfoot. The house itself rose from the earth like some ancient creature, long asleep, but faintly listening. Though not grand by aristocratic standards, it bore the quiet dignity of old English households, ivy-clad walls, narrow windows, and a silence so complete it seemed to hold its breath. Holmes said nothing as the butler admitted us. His gaze passed over the entryway, the polished banisters, the tall clock that ticked with a funereal precision. There is something here, Watson, he murmured, removing his gloves. Some weight in the walls. Not guilt, perhaps, but expectation. And as we followed our hostess into the darker heart of the house, I could not shake the impression that the rooms themselves had been waiting for someone to listen. Miss Willoughby led us to the study where her father had died. It was a sombre room, lined with leather-bound volumes and framed by the familiar architecture of a legal mind, precise, ordered, utterly devoid of sentiment. The hearth lay cold, the desk neat, save for a blotter, a silver pen holder, and a leather-bound ledger unopened. Holmes's eye flicked across the space like a man scanning a coded telegram. The fall occurred here? He asked. Yes, she replied. At the corner of the desk. He knelt, fingers hovering inches from the wood, then turned toward the carpet beneath the shelves. Blood here, he said. But no scuff marks, no signs of struggle. Curious. Holmes next examined the bell pull by the fireplace, fingering its tassels with exaggerated delicacy. The rope is ever so slightly frayed, Watson. No accident would think to damage it, but a man planning an illusion might. I looked to Miss Willoughby. She said nothing, only watched Holmes as though he might speak to the walls themselves. Holmes rose and moved toward the corner where a small side table bore a silver tray. He stood for a moment, eyes half closed, nostrils flaring subtly like a hound catching wind. You smell it too, Watson? He asked. I'm afraid not, I admitted. Indeed, few would. It is faint, a ghost of a scent. But it is there. Veratrum. The name stirred memory. The poison. An ancient one, though now largely out of fashion. Its charm lies in mimicry, heart failure, fainting, even stroke. It leaves little behind but a death that seems inevitable. He turned back to the desk. A man dies. A cup lies fractured, and a faint perfume of murder lingers in the air. Long enough for a man who has trained his senses to know it. He looked up then. Judge Willoughby did not fall, Watson. He was guided down. We followed Holmes to the drawing room, where Miss Willoughby indicated the glass cabinet that held her mother's teacup set. The door was locked, the key dangling from her chatelaine. She opened it with a care that bordered on reverence. Holmes examined each cup in turn, inspecting the rims, the bases, the pattern of glaze. Then he paused at the third cup from the left. Tell me, who has touched this cabinet in the last fortnight? No one but myself, she replied. He withdrew a small magnifying glass from his pocket and peered closely at the porcelain. Then we must ask how this fingerprint arrived here. He stepped aside so we might see. A single, clean, elliptical print, placed deliberately near the base of the cup. Too perfect, he murmured. Too centered. A print left in haste smudges. This one is theatrical. Someone wants to be noticed, or believes they cannot be traced. We were still examining the cabinet when the door creaked open and a voice, bright, fluid, and unmistakably self-assured, entered with its owner. Ah, visitors at Hollow Graange. How rare and refreshing, said the man who stepped into the room. He was in his early 30s, fair-haired and well-groomed, with the sort of smile that had once opened many doors in far-off colonies, and likely closed a few behind him. Felix Willoughby, he said, offering his hand. Cousin to the late judge, and I suppose interim host. Holmes's handshake was brief. Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. A pleasure. Though I admit, I had expected inspectors, not investigators. He chuckled, adjusting his cuffs. Still, I should be of no help. I was out riding the day my uncle passed. Quite the dreadful business. Holmes offered no reply. But I noticed, as we left the room, that he sniffed once, almost imperceptibly, at the air Felix had walked through. While Holmes took his time in the drawing room, I found myself speaking with the butler, Mr. Greaves, a stooped and silent man with eyes that rarely met one's own. He had been with the judge for decades, and when I asked politely about the morning of the incident, he replied only, "There was nothing out of the ordinary, sir. His Honour took tea in the library, called for no one, and was found after lunch by Miss Lavinia." But there was something else, a hesitation, a flicker of discomfort at the mention of tea. I pressed no further. Later, Holmes cornered the maid, a slight girl named Celia, barely 20. "Did anyone else call at the house last week, Miss Celia?" "No, sir," she answered, then bit her lip. "Except there was a man, tall, with a limp. He came Tuesday afternoon. I didn't see his face." "A man with a limp?" Holmes repeated softly. "Yes, sir. The judge sent me away when I brought the tray in." They argued, loudly. Holmes thanked her with a rare nod. Sometimes it is the smallest voices that recall the sharpest sounds. As the evening darkened, Holmes drew me once again into the study. The fire had been lit, more for comfort than warmth, and it cast flickering shadows over the furnishings. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "do you recall the bell pull beside the hearth?" I nodded. "You remarked earlier that it was frayed." "Indeed. But look more closely." He handed me his magnifying lens, and I crouched to inspect the tasseled rope. Just above eye level, one portion of the fabric was blackened faintly, not with soot from the fire, but with something far more telling. "Burn marks?" I asked. "Precisely, and not from open flame, but from heated metal, applied deliberately. Holmes stood, hands in his pockets. The rope was weakened, Watson. Not enough to snap with a tug, but sufficient to give way if pulled in haste, say by a man collapsing. You mean to say it was staged? Exactly. A performance of a death, and like all theatre, dependent on props, cues, and misdirection. Holmes moved to the desk and began arranging several items upon it. The ledger, the blotter, the inkstand, the fractured teacup. Consider the scene, he said. An elderly judge, alone in his study. A rope weakened just enough. A cup from a locked cabinet, introduced with no plausible reason. A poison nearly undetectable. And now, he lifted the inkstand and held it to the firelight. A faint white residue clung to its base. Silver nitrate, he announced. I blinked. Mixed into the tea. Or perhaps placed within the cup's glaze. Reacts when heated or in combination with certain medicines. Either method would be sufficient to render a subtle but fatal result. Holmes turned to me. The cup is no more an accident than the fall. It was all designed, carefully, quietly, and with the confidence of one who believed himself beyond suspicion. And the limping man? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A distraction, perhaps, or a ghost from the judge's past. He tapped the rim of the cup gently. Either way, Watson, the truth is here, hidden in plain sight. It was nearing midnight when Holmes at last took his leave of the study and declared his intention to retire. I've heard enough, he said simply. And seen enough, I asked. A great deal, Watson, but I suspect the house has more to say. We ascended the stairs, and Holmes paused once outside his temporary chamber. This house, he said, was built for reason. Rooms aligned with logic, routines enforced by habit, secrets tucked into structure. But something in its rhythm has shifted. A silence where there was once noise, an echo out of place. I raised an eyebrow. You're speaking of the architecture? I'm speaking of the people within it. He stepped inside, leaving me in the corridor with only his final remark hanging in the dark. The house itself, Watson, is a witness. We need only learn how to listen. The following morning, Holmes rose early and took his leave without a word of explanation. He had a way of vanishing that could, at times, unnerve even those closest to him. One moment he would be there. The next, only the lingering scent of pipe smoke and a half-folded newspaper would remain. When I inquired after him, Miss Willoughby replied that he had asked for directions to a nearby post office, though I suspected that was not his true destination. He returned some hours later, his cuffs faintly dusted and his boots bearing the reddish clay of village lanes. "Well?" I asked. "Pleasant air," he said, brushing his coat. A productive morning. I trust the teacups have remained stationary in my absence. I frowned. "Holmes, what did you find?" He merely tapped his fingers against the mantelpiece and gave a small, satisfied smile. "Nothing I did not expect, Watson, but everything I required." It was only that evening, over a hasty supper of cold ham and cheese, that Holmes began to share the fruits of his wandering. "There is a certain establishment," he said, "a public house by the name of the Crooked Fox, nestled just off the main road, a haunt for local labourers and those with pasts they'd rather not recount. I passed an hour there in a less recognisable form." I arched a brow. Disguise again? A tinker's cap, a Welsh accent, and a certain slouch that makes one forgettable. The barmaid was loose of tongue. According to her, a man with a limp had been staying in the village until 3 days ago. Quiet fellow. Didn't give a name, but had the look of someone recently loosed from a cage. Holmes paused to butter a crust of bread. He asked about Hollow Graange, about the judge, and then vanished the night the man died. I set down my fork. "You think he did it?" Holmes shrugged. I think someone wanted us to think that, which in my experience is a far more dangerous intention. The next morning, as Holmes busied himself with a lengthy note to Inspector Lestrade, I took it upon myself to investigate this limping stranger further. Miss Willoughby, though reluctant at first, admitted that the name Ainsley had once crossed her father's lips, and never fondly. A brief search of the judge's journals revealed an entry, 15 years old, concerning one Rupert Ainsley, convicted of embezzlement and fraud, sentenced to 12 years hard labour at Dartmoor. The name was underlined twice in red ink, an unusual flourish for a man as unemotional as Willoughby had been. I returned to Holmes with the paper in hand. He had a reason, Holmes. A grudge. As many do, Holmes replied without looking up. But motive alone does not murder make. It is the orchestration I am after, and Ainsley, I think, is more music note than conductor. He sealed his letter with wax, then smiled faintly. Still, it is always helpful to know who stands behind the curtain, even if they never speak a line. Holmes requested to be left alone in the study for an hour that evening, and I, understanding the peculiar sacredness with which he treated solitude, complied without argument. When I returned, he was seated at the judge's desk, the surface cleared and his long fingers drumming thoughtfully upon the wood. "Watson," he said, "if a man keeps secrets, he must keep them somewhere. You found something." "I found something that tried not to be found." He gestured toward the lower left drawer. "A false bottom. Poorly constructed, I might add. Judge Willoughby was many things, but he was not a carpenter." Within the cavity lay a folded parchment, crisp and unsealed. Holmes passed it to me. It was a will, dated 1 week before the judge's death, and in it, every significant asset, estate, holdings, investments, had been left not to Cousin Felix, but to Miss Lavinia Willoughby. The version read publicly, I said, named Felix. "Precisely. So we must ask, who knew about this revision, and more importantly—" He stood slowly, eyes sharp. "Who ensured it would never reach a solicitor?" Back in the study, Holmes spread the 2 wills across the desk, one beside the other. The false bottom version beneath his fingertips, the publicly presented one beside it. "Note the difference, Watson," he said. "The true will, dated and written in the judge's unmistakable hand, names Miss Willoughby sole heir. This other," he tapped the document dismissively, "bears only his printed name, no signature, no seal." "But it was read aloud as official," I replied. "Indeed, and yet no solicitor confirmed it, no witnesses are cited, and it was produced the day after the death by Felix Willoughby himself. Curious, is it not?" "Then Felix presented a will he knew to be invalid?" "Or hoped would be accepted without question," Holmes replied. "In grief, families overlook many things. Inheritance is often decided not by law but by momentum." He leaned back. "But you see, Watson, that momentum has shifted, and when a man builds his fortune on a lie, the collapse is often sudden and irreversible. It was I who found the second teacup. I confess it was pure chance. I had stooped to poke at the hearth for warmth and noticed something glinting behind the iron grate. Pale porcelain, dulled with ash. I retrieved it with tongs. It was another from the same set, celadon glaze, gold rim. But unlike the one Miss Willoughby had brought us, this one was unbroken. Holmes took it in silence, turning it gently in his hands. "Remarkable," he murmured. "So this is the cup that was meant to be used, and the fractured one." "Switched," I said. He nodded. "Precisely. But why go to the trouble?" "Because, my dear Watson, the fractured cup tells a story. One of chaos, of a fall, of shattering. This unbroken one tells another, calm, order, And poison. Holmes stared into the cold hearth. Our killer did not merely kill. He crafted a narrative, but something frightened him. And so he hid the truth in ashes and left us the lie on display. He handed me the cup, eyes narrowing, which means the truth was never meant for us, but for someone else entirely. Holmes placed both cups upon the desk, the fractured, prominently displayed, the unbroken, streaked with soot. "This," he said, gesturing to the fractured cup, "is theatre. A propriedade. Its placement beside the body was no accident. It was meant to evoke confusion, not clarity." I studied the jagged break again. It was clean, almost unnatural. "Because it was induced," Holmes replied. "I suspect silver nitrate was embedded within the base. Once liquid was poured, a chemical reaction would stress the cup, producing the fracture from within. And the result?" "Dramatic," Holmes said, his eyes glinting. "A story of suddenness, of misfortune. But it also serves another purpose, a warning, not to the police, who would miss it entirely, but to someone in the house. A message meant to say, 'I know what you did.'" I blinked. "You think the killer left a signal?" "No, Watson," Holmes said. "I think the victim did, or someone on his behalf." He folded his arms. "And we must now determine who saw the message, and who responded by burying it in flame." Holmes stood at the hearth, the fractured cup once more in hand. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than usual, almost thoughtful. "Watson," he said, "we have been focused on evidence, cups, wills, fingerprints, but these are the physical fragments of a larger fracture, one not in objects, but in narrative." I frowned. "You mean the story doesn't add up?" "Not simply that," Holmes replied. "Stories, when true, move with rhythm. They flow. But here, the facts clash like mismatched keys. A teacup in the wrong room. A rope frayed deliberately. A man who dies without a mark, but leaves a message without a voice." He turned to me then. "Someone told the truth, Watson, but not with words, with silence, with placement." He set the fractured cup gently on the mantel. "And so, the question is not what happened, but why it was told the way it was." That evening, Holmes summoned Miss Willoughby, the maid, the butler, and cousin Felix to the drawing room. With the air of a conductor preparing for a symphony, he delivered his instructions with calm precision. "Tomorrow evening," he said, "we shall gather once more, at 9 o'clock sharp, in the study. I expect you all to be present." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Is this to be a séance, Mr. Holmes, or a verdict?" Holmes met his gaze evenly. "Neither. It shall be a performance. But of truth, not illusion." I followed Holmes as he departed, puzzled. "What are you planning?" "A presentation," he replied, "of all the fragments, lined up, turned over, and reassembled." "You mean to trap the killer?" "No," Holmes said, pausing at the stair. "I mean to let the killer trap himself. The weight of the lie will do the rest." And with that, he disappeared into the upstairs corridor, leaving only the fractured cup resting on the mantel, and a silence that felt very much like the tightening of a noose. At precisely 9 o'clock, as the grandfather clock in the hallway struck its first note, the guests arrived one by one to the late Judge Willoughby's study, drawn, I imagine, by a mixture of curiosity, dread, and Holmes's tone of absolute command. Miss Lavinia entered first, composed as ever, though the faint tremble in her gloved fingers betrayed her anticipation. Felix followed soon after, dressed too well for the occasion, and bearing the smug indifference of a man who believed himself immune to consequence. The butler, Mr. Greaves, took up a quiet post near the bookshelf, while the maid stood nervously by the door, her eyes flitting from Holmes to Felix and back again. Last came the limping stranger, Rupert Ainsley, recently arrived under Holmes' instruction. His eyes were sunken but sharp, his gait deliberate and proud, as though defying the room to find him guilty by posture alone. Holmes, standing by the desk, gestured silently to the object at its center, the fractured teacup, resting atop a folded napkin like a relic on an altar. "It is time," he said simply. "Let us hear the story, told properly, and at last." Holmes moved to the hearth, and with 3 swift motions, rekindled the fire that had long since gone cold. The flames caught quickly, casting a glow upon the faces gathered in that crowded, silent room. He turned, and without ceremony began. "We meet tonight not in search of theory, but of clarity," he said. "Each of you holds a piece of the story, but you've seen only fragments, moments, sounds, gestures. Tonight, I offer the whole." He stepped toward the desk. 3 days ago, Judge Willoughby died in this room. Officially, it was a fall, sudden, tragic, unremarkable. But his fall was no accident. It was planned. A flicker crossed Felix's face, but he said nothing. Holmes continued. "Let us consider the facts. A rope, frayed deliberately. A will, unsigned and yet presented as truth. And this," he gestured to the teacup, "a porcelain contradiction. Part of a locked set, yet present in a room where it did not belong." Holmes now circled the group slowly. "We have before us not just a death, but a performance, staged with care, cast with precision, and executed with just enough deceit to pass as chance." He paused by the hearth, voice low. "But the stage has cracked, and the truth now seeps through." Holmes now retrieved from his coat a small vial, which he held up in the firelight. The liquid within was colourless, unassuming. "This," he said, "is silver nitrate. Harmless, inert, until it is provoked. Once introduced to certain chemical compounds, such as those found in Judge Willoughby's heart medication, it produces a violent reaction." There was a murmur among the group. Even Felix leaned forward, the first hint of true unease clouding his composure. "Now," Holmes continued, "imagine a man, clever, cautious, who introduces a minute quantity of silver nitrate into the glaze of a teacup. Not enough to be noticed, just enough to react when heated, or when combined with prescribed medicine." He held up the fractured cup. The resulting chemical reaction weakens the ceramic from within. The fracture spreads suddenly, alarmingly, a shattering illusion, and with it, a man collapses, not from a stumble, but from cardiac failure accelerated by the very compound introduced. I stared at the cup with new understanding. "So, the cup cracked itself?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed. It fractured at the moment it delivered its secret. A final silent burst of truth." He set the cup gently on the desk once more. "It is not the object that is dangerous," he said. "It is the confidence of the hand that wielded it." A voice broke the silence then, hoarse, desperate, and bitter with years. "You think I did this?" Ainsley cried. "That I crept into this house to poison a man and hide behind a cracked cup?" Holmes did not even turn. "Mr. Ainsley, you were brought here not as suspect, but as narrative. Someone desired your presence to muddy the waters." Ainsley took a faltering step forward. "I serve my sentence. 15 years. I walk with a limp because of it. And now I am dragged here like some phantom from the past." "No," Holmes said calmly. "You were summoned by circumstance, not by me. But the man who staged this death counted on your name being whispered. He hoped your reputation would distract from his." Ainsley stared at the teacup, and then at Felix. "Then you believe me?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that you are not the playwright of this tragedy, only the shadow behind the curtain." Ainsley said no more, but I watched the tension fall from his shoulders like dust shaken from an old coat. A man who, though still branded by guilt, had not worn this crime. Holmes now walked to the judge's desk and stood beside it with quiet reverence. The fractured teacup remained in the centre, as if presiding over the scene like a silent witness. "Let us imagine the judge on the final evening of his life," Holmes said. "He sits here as he often did, taking his nightly draught. Perhaps he feels faint, a tightness in the chest, a dizziness brought on not by age, but by chemical interference. He turned to the bell pull near the hearth. And so, instinctively, he rises to summon help. His hand reaches for the rope. With that, Holmes yanked it. The bell gave a delayed and feeble rattle. But the rope, already frayed near the upper bracket, gives slightly under the pressure. It throws him off balance. His gait falters, the poisoned heart gives way, and he collapses. A perfect simulation of a natural fall. Holmes's voice now dropped. And when the body is discovered, what remains? A broken cup, a frayed rope, and no sign of violence. He looked around the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed was not an accident, but an arrangement, a carefully executed illusion, not of misfortune, but of design." There was a silence after Holmes's demonstration that seemed to thicken the air itself. Then, with that same measured gravity, he turned slowly to face the group. "One man stood to gain from Judge Willoughby's death. One man introduced a false will. One man had access to the judge's medicine cabinet, the teacup cabinet, and the knowledge to exploit both." Felix shifted uncomfortably. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes." "No, Mr. Willoughby, I speak plainly, for you are the riddle, and the answer alike." Gasps escaped from both maid and mistress. Felix raised his chin, a veneer of confidence already beginning to crack. "You knew of the true will, which left you nothing. You obtained or forged a public version and hoped no one would contest it. But you feared the judge might yet speak, or rewrite it again. So you silenced him." "I deny it." "Then why present a will that was unsigned?" Holmes asked coldly. "Why poison a cup meant to fracture upon use? Why sabotage a bell pull and hide a second unbroken cup in the hearth?" Felix said nothing. Holmes stepped forward. "You, sir, murdered your uncle, and then wrote yourself into a fiction, one that ends tonight." But Felix did not collapse beneath the weight of Holmes's accusation. Instead, he drew a folded letter from his breast pocket and held it aloft with theatrical flair. "If we are to speak of documents, Mr. Holmes, then allow me to contribute one more." Holmes took it, opened it, and scanned it quickly. I watched his eyes narrow. "It is from the family solicitor," Felix announced. "It states, quite legally, that the newer will you claim to have found in the desk is unsigned and unwitnessed, meaning, of course, it is inadmissible and therefore invalid." He turned toward Miss Willoughby, smiling with unsettling triumph. "So I do remain heir, despite your gallant efforts." Miss Willoughby said nothing. I saw a flicker of fury pass across her face, but she held her composure. Felix now moved confidently toward the study door. "Unless you have a signature, Holmes, and I very much doubt you do, then I shall take my leave and let the law decide the rest." Holmes did not follow. He remained by the fireplace, staring into the coals as if reading something yet unwritten. "I do not have a signature, Mr. Willoughby," he said at last, "but I do have a witness, one the court may find even harder to ignore." Holmes turned to the butler, who had stood silently throughout the performance, hands clasped behind his back, as rigid as a grandfather clock. "Mr. Greaves," Holmes said gently, "would you be so kind?" The old man stepped forward, drawing a folded envelope from within his jacket. "I sent this to Scotland Yard this morning, sir. Special post, by Mr. Holmes's request." Felix's face paled. "What is that?" "A statement," Holmes replied, "written in Greaves's hand, signed and dated, recounting a conversation he overheard 3 nights ago. A conversation between you and the family solicitor, in which you expressed your intention to suppress the new will, and accelerate the judge's demise before anything else could be revised. Felix spun toward the butler. "You lying relic!" "I lie less than you poison, sir," Greaves said, with a dignity that seemed to age him 20 years in reverse. Holmes now approached Felix slowly. "You may indeed escape the consequences of a forged will. The law can be technical, even unkind. But attempted murder and fraudulent inheritance, Scotland Yard is rarely so forgiving." Felix stood frozen. Holmes spoke softly now. "You prepared for everything, except the servant who listened, the witness who didn't speak, until now." Inspector Lestrade arrived the following morning, having been telegraphed immediately after the evening's events. Felix Willoughby, who had spent the night under watch in the drawing room, offered no resistance. He merely stared into space, the weight of revelation finally pressing down with silent fury. Miss Willoughby, for her part, remained dignified throughout the process. She watched her cousin be led from Hollow Graange without triumph, without bitterness, only a solemnity befitting the echo of justice long overdue. Holmes offered Lestrade a succinct summary and presented the supporting evidence: the forged will, the poisoned teacup, the hidden print, and the butler's sworn statement. The inspector, to his credit, asked few questions. "Attempted murder," he said grimly, "and conspiracy to defraud. Even without the poison, that'll be enough to ruin him for life." "It was never about ruin," Holmes replied. "Only correction." As the carriage rolled away with its disgraced passenger, Holmes turned to me. "You see, Watson, a crime is like an equation. When balanced, it disappears. But when one side grows too greedy..." He gestured at the empty drive. "The imbalance tips the world. Eventually, gravity wins." I said nothing, only followed him back inside, where the fire still burned. Later that afternoon, as the winter light filtered through the curtains, Holmes sat once more beside the study hearth, the fractured teacup resting on the desk before him. He turned it slowly in his fingers, the jagged break catching light like a wound. "It is remarkable, is it not, Watson," he said at length, "how something so small can carry the weight of a man's life?" I nodded. "And death." Holmes gave the faintest of smiles. "The cup was both vessel and verdict." I looked at him. "Did you know from the start?" I suspected, but the story was incomplete. The key was not the cup itself, but that it appeared at all. A lie left too proudly displayed often reveals the truth behind it. He rose, placing the cup carefully back into its box. "There is always a fracture, Watson, in plans, in people. Sometimes physical, sometimes moral." I watched him walk to the door, coat already in hand. "And in this case," he looked back at me, eyes sharp, "in this case, the fracture was just wide enough to let the truth escape." And with that, we left Hollow Graange, the silence behind us repaired, and justice, however cracked, restored. It was 2 days after our return from Hollow Graange, when Holmes resumed his place in the old armchair at Baker Street, violin resting untouched beside him, fingers tented in familiar repose. Outside, London resumed its eternal grey shuffle. Hansoms clattered, newsboys shouted, and the distant bells of St. Dunstan's struck the hour with indifference. Inside, however, the air was different, clearer, the kind of calm that arrives only after a storm has spent itself in full. I poured tea while Holmes stirred nothing in particular with a long-handled spoon. "You've hardly spoken since we returned," I said. Holmes gave a faint smile. "Speech is a luxury, Watson. Silence is a verdict." He picked up the fractured teacup, which now sat, cleaned but still broken, on the windowsill. "The case was never about violence," he mused, "nor even inheritance. It was about narrative control, a man who sought to recast his role from parasite to heir, and nearly succeeded. He turned toward me. But in every story, Watson, there remains an element the author cannot fully master: the reaction of the audience. He tapped the teacup once. In this case, the audience was the house itself. We dined that evening on roast mutton and boiled potatoes, during which Holmes, in a more reflective mood, finally lifted the veil on the earliest inklings of his suspicion. "You recall, Watson, my disinterest at first," he said. "Another judge dead in his study, hardly a novelty." "Until the lady arrived," I noted. "Indeed. But it was not the client that caught my attention. It was the scent." I looked up from my glass. "The veratrum." He nodded. "Faint, bitter, and unmistakable once recognized. It lingers like remorse, and in this case was woven into the fibers of the hearthrug. No accident would leave such a whisper." I frowned. "But why would the killer allow such a trace?" "Because the killer believed it undetectable. Veratrum has no taste when properly prepared, no smell to the average man. But the judge had used it before, likely in small doses, to temper his nerves. The killer merely increased the dose." Holmes sipped his wine. But the scent did not match the usual bitterness of ingestion. It was infused, brewed in liquid, which led me, of course, to the teacup. He gave a slight smile. "Death brewed, Watson. Not swallowed, steeped." Holmes rose from his seat and crossed to the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. "The bell rope, Watson. What did you see?" "A frayed section, slightly blackened," I replied. "Precisely. But consider this. A man feeling unwell reaches for assistance. He tugs the rope. If the rope gives way, even a little, his center of balance shifts. Combine this with an accelerating heart already under strain, and the result is fatal." Holmes turned. "Now add a fractured teacup beside the body, shattered not by clumsiness, but by chemical stress, a delayed internal fissure, designed to fail at the moment of heat or contact." "A performance," I murmured. Holmes smiled. "Yes, a small, lethal theatre." He stepped back toward the table. Judge Willoughby was not murdered in anger. He was executed with forethought, each element calibrated: a poisoned cup to induce collapse, a sabotaged rope to complete the illusion, and a planted will to divert suspicion. "And the fractured cup?" "A flourish," Holmes said. "A magician's distraction. It told a story of clumsiness and surprise. But only a story." He looked out toward the street. "The brilliance of the lie, Watson, was not in its boldness, but in how comfortably it fit what everyone expected to see." Holmes returned to his chair and resumed his usual languor, but the edge in his voice betrayed the energy still coursing beneath his composed exterior. "Felix Willoughby," he said, "possessed neither the intelligence for invention nor the discipline for restraint, yet he managed both in brief measure because of desperation." "You used the forged will against him," I said. "Indeed. I let him think I believed it," Holmes replied. "Allowed him to assume the unsigned document had passed unnoticed. That bolstered his confidence. He grew careless." I nodded. "Hence the letter from the solicitor." "Which I had already read. Felix had visited the man the week prior, seeking legal reassurance. He did not get it. But he believed the lack of witnesses was a private matter." "And you?" "I simply waited," Holmes said. "Watched for the moment when his arrogance would overtake his strategy." He stood again and walked to the teacup once more. "To catch a liar, Watson, you must first let him think his story is believed. Then quietly, you widen the cracks." He tapped the fractured cup with his finger. "And eventually the facade shatters from within." I set down my teacup, whole, unpoisoned, and steaming gently, and turned to Holmes with a mixture of admiration and frustration. that had become all too familiar over the years. "You might have told me," I said. Holmes, lounging on the settee with a slippered foot resting on the edge of the hearthrug, did not look up. "I tell you what you need to know, Watson. No more, no less." I felt my temper stir. "You let me blunder through hollow Graange, questioning fingerprints and footprints, while you'd already deduced the method of the crime from a scent and a frayed rope." "Not quite," Holmes said mildly. "I suspected. I confirmed. You, meanwhile, observed the human element, something I, at times, neglect." "Is that meant to be a compliment?" "It's meant to be a compliment in disguise," Holmes said with a smirk. I sighed, sinking into my chair. "One day, Holmes, I shall write a version of these adventures in which you are thoroughly fallible." "I look forward to reading it," he said dryly. "Just be sure to spell my name correctly." He stretched his arms behind his head. "Besides, you do enjoy the surprise endings, do you not?" Reluctantly, I nodded. After a pause, I asked the question that had been quietly growing in my mind since our departure from Hollow Graange. "And what of Miss Willoughby?" Holmes opened one eye, then closed it again. "She has inherited the estate, I imagine, or will once the courts finish untangling Felix's legal thickets." "She struck me as extraordinarily composed," I said. "Even as her cousin was taken away." Holmes nodded. "Composed and clever. She said little, and that is often the mark of those who understand much. You admire her." "I respect her," he replied. "There is a difference." I studied him. "You think she suspected Felix all along?" Holmes's fingers drummed once on the arm of his chair. "Not suspected, knew. But silence was her protection. In households like Hollow Graange, Watson, noise invites retaliation. Quiet, on the other hand, observes, waits." He sat up slightly. "And when the opportunity finally came, a fractured cup, a peculiar visitor, a London detective, she allowed the truth to do what she could not." There was something in his tone, not quite sympathy, not quite melancholy, that struck me as rare. "Do you think she'll be all right?" Holmes considered. "Miss Willoughby is stronger than she looks. Glass may shatter, Watson, but porcelain holds." The fire had burned low by now, and a comfortable quiet filled the room. I sat watching the coals settle, while Holmes, as ever, contemplated abstractions that eluded most men entirely. "It is curious, is it not," he said at last, "that justice so rarely aligns with law." "You mean Felix's arrest?" "I mean the broader shape of things," Holmes said. "Laws are blunt instruments, necessary, yes, but often ill-suited to the delicacy of human affairs. They punish action, but struggle with intention. They weigh deeds, but rarely consider truth in its full dimension." I thought of Felix's confident smile before the butler spoke, of Miss Willoughby's clenched hands, of the teacup placed with theatrical precision beside a dying man. "You believe justice has been done?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I believe truth has been restored to the surface, the lie cracked, the performance exposed. That is a kind of justice. Not legal, perhaps, but moral." He paused. "Felix may serve a sentence, or wriggle through loopholes. It matters little now. He has been seen for what he is. That, Watson, is the real verdict." I nodded slowly. "And the judge?" Holmes leaned back. "He left us the final word. Fractured, yes, but unmistakably his." Holmes reached again for the fractured cup, its golden rim now dulled with age and consequence, and held it before the fire, letting the light trace its jagged wound. "There is something poetic, is there not?" he murmured, "about the nature of fracture." I raised an eyebrow. "The finest porcelain," he continued, "is often the most brittle, elegant, composed, expensive, and yet the slightest fault in its making, and it can split down its spine from a whisper of stress. "Are you speaking of the cup?" I asked. "Or of people?" "Both," Holmes said. Judge Willoughby was a man of rigid control, order. He thought by arranging his will, both the legal and the emotional kind, he could preserve harmony. But he left a weakness unsealed. Felix. I watched the broken vessel turn slowly in his hands. "And yet," Holmes said, "it was not the crack itself that ruined the cup. It was its concealment. Had it been repaired, acknowledged, it might have held. But hidden, it was doomed to fail at the worst moment." He placed it gently on the windowsill. "And that, Watson, is the nature of truth. You may suppress it, seal it behind cabinets and contracts, but once fractured, it will always, inevitably, find its way out." He rose. "Even through porcelain." It was a quiet afternoon in Baker Street, several weeks after the events at Hollow Graange had concluded. The weather had returned to its habitual London murk, and Holmes, true to form, had retreated into one of his periods of violinic introspection, bow-gliding gently over the strings as though plucking thoughts from the fog. I sat with a book upon my lap, scarcely read, my thoughts drawn instead to that fractured teacup, the silent maid, the smirking cousin, and the house that had concealed a murder beneath the veneer of civility. Holmes, without so much as glancing at me, suddenly said, "The most dangerous crimes, Watson, are those that ask us to trust what we see." He returned to his playing. It was always like this. The case would end, the papers would forget, but Holmes would carry its residue in silence, translating human deception into music that only he could decipher. That same afternoon, Mrs. Hudson entered with a modest brown package and a cream-coloured envelope sealed in a neat feminine hand. Holmes opened it without ceremony, but paused at the object within. It was a single teacup, not fractured, not marked, pristine. The same rare Chinese export pattern as the original, gold-rimmed and quietly elegant. Holmes unfolded the note and read it aloud, almost absently. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for restoring what was nearly taken. I enclose this not as a relic, but as a replacement, not for the one that broke, but for the truth it revealed. Lavinia Willoughby." He turned the cup slowly in his hand, studying its base. "Unbroken," he murmured. "How rare that is." There was the faintest smile on his lips, not triumph, but something gentler, something like respect. He placed the cup beside the fireplace, far from harm. "An uncommon woman," he said. Holmes rose from his chair, the cup in hand, and examined it against the weak sunlight filtering through our sooty windows. "Well, Watson," he said, his tone light, "let us hope this one stays intact." There was a mischievous twinkle in his eye, the sort that surfaced only after a puzzle had been solved to his satisfaction, and not a moment before. I chuckled. "No fractures? No messages? No concealed poisons?" Holmes sipped his tea with exaggerated caution. "Not yet." We both laughed, softly, but with the kind of shared understanding, only earned through danger past and secrets uncovered. As Holmes turned again to his violin and resumed his mournful bowing, I found myself reflecting on the strangeness of the case that had begun with a single fractured teacup and ended with the exposure of a carefully engineered crime. It struck me how the most delicate objects often concealed the most intricate truths. A crack in porcelain revealed the fracture in a family. A cup, planted as misdirection, had become the very thing that restored direction to the narrative. I thought of Miss Willoughby, composed, elegant, silent, and of Felix, clever enough to scheme, but not wise enough to suspect that the truth, like porcelain, may break but rarely disappears. In the end, it was not the law that uncovered him, nor the will, nor even the poison. It was the fracture. Sometimes, I mused, the finest lies must first crack before the truth can pour through. As dusk fell and the city groaned with the weariness of another day, Holmes returned from his instrument and sat opposite me, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "There's a letter on the mantel," he said, eyes fixed on mine. I hadn't noticed it before. A simple white envelope, sealed in red wax. "It arrived this morning," he continued. "No return address, but there's a peculiar scent, iron and parchment." I reached for it, hesitated. Holmes smiled faintly. "Don't open it just yet. Its contents bleed." "Bleed?" His eyes sparkled. Figuratively, one hopes. I tucked it away, unsettled. So began quietly the next of our strange adventures, seeded not in violence, but in veiled suggestion. And as Holmes resumed his silence and the fire hissed low, I found myself already wondering what secrets lay behind the next sealed envelope. But for now, the cup remained whole. Holmes remained at the window long after the last light faded, the fractured teacup resting beside him like a forgotten clue. "You know, Watson," he murmured, "truth, when hidden, does not vanish. It waits. Beneath porcelain, beneath civility, beneath silence." He turned, his gaze distant yet precise. "The most dangerous lies are not shouted. They are arranged, carefully, elegantly, until someone listens not to what was said, but to what was missing." I nodded, struck again by how close deception can sit beside grace. "What do you think was the criminal's greatest miscalculation? The forged will, the poisoned cup, or something even more subtle? I'd love to know what you think. Share your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this case, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Share this story with a fellow mystery lover. You never know who might notice the next crack in the case.